welcome back to Unit 6. Today we're going to be starting with Unit 6 by talking about the identity and inverse properties. We've got those laid out below us. We've got identity on the left, inverse on the right. So let's go ahead and get started with the identity one there on the left. So when talking about the identity property, we have two different identity properties. We have an additive identity property and a multiplicative identity property. So one of those applies to addition, the other applies to multiplication. We're going to talk about the additive one first. And that states the sum of a number and 0 is going to equal the number itself. And we've got a couple of examples down there. 5 plus 0 equals 5. So notice when I added 0 to 5, I got 5, or I got the number itself. I identified it. And the symbolic example of that would be 0 plus y. When I add 0 to y, I still end up with y. Then when we're talking about the multiplicative identity property, that states the product of a number and 1 is itself. So anytime that I multiply something times 1, I'm going to get that number. So our example down there for numerical is negative 16 times 1 is going to give us negative 16. And our symbolic example is 1 times x is x. So that sums up the identity property for us. Now let's take a look at the inverse property. Now we've talked about inverse before. We've talked about inverse operations and solving equations. So we're going to be talking about what the inverse property actually is. We have two inverse properties. We have an additive inverse property and a multiplicative inverse property. One is going to apply to addition. The other is going to apply to multiplication. So let's take a look at the additive one first. And that states the sum of a number and its opposite is 0. So an example of this is 6 plus negative 6 gives us 0. So an inverse property is when things are going to cancel each other out. So in this case, 6 plus negative 6 is going to cancel each other out and give us 0. Our symbolic example of that is negative 2x plus 2x is going to give us 0. Now talking about the multiplicative inverse property, that states the product. Remember, the product is an answer to a multiplication problem. The product of a number and itself is going to, or its inverse is going to equal 1. So anytime that you're multiplying something times its inverse, it's going to give us 1. It's not going to give us 0, because when we multiply by 0, that's a different property. That's the 0 property of multiplication. So the inverse property is when we multiply the opposites together, or the inverses together, and it's going to give us 1. So our numerical example of that is 1 over 8 times 8, which would be 8 over 1, is going to equal 1. And our symbolic example of that is 2/3 x. We multiply that by its inverse, so the opposite of 2 over 3 is 3 over 2. When we do that, they're going to all cancel out and going to give us 1x. That brings us to the end of what going over the properties looks like. Now let's do a few examples. So here we are at example A, and it says which property is demonstrated. So we're going to go through, we're going to figure out which one of each of these properties are, then we're going to let you try a few on your own. So the first one, number 1, says 3 over 8 times 1/2 times 1. And then when I look at the other side of the equation, I have 3/8 times 1/2. So all that happened was I multiplied by 1, and I got the same thing I already had. So when I multiply by 1 and I end up with the same answer I already started with, I know that's the identity property. And since I multiplied, I know I'm talking about the identity property of multiplication. Now let's take a look at number 2. In number 2, I have negative 6 times 4 plus 0 inside the parentheses, and when I look at the other side of the equation, I just have negative 6 times 4. So what happened? We added the 4 and the 0 together, and we got 4. So I had 4, I added 0 to it, I still have 4. So since I have the same thing after adding 0 to it, I know that is the identity property of addition since I was adding. Number 3 says 15 plus negative 8 plus 8 is going to equal 15 plus 0. So what happened? The negative 8 and the positive 8 canceled out to give me 0. So when I have two things that cancel out to give me 0, I know that that's talking about the inverse property. And since I was adding, I know I have the inverse property of addition, or the additive inverse property. You can say either one, both are correct. In number 4, I have 6 times 1, 6 plus 6 equals 1 plus 6. So what happened? The 6 times 1, 6 canceled each other out, because remember, 6 is the same as 6 over 1, so they are opposites, or they are inverses, so they cancel each other out and give you 1. So what do we call that? We call that the inverse property of multiplication, or the multiplicative inverse property. Again, both are the same. You could write either one. Now let's look at example B. Example B says select all the examples of the given property. For number 5, it wants us to find the identity property of multiplication. And number 6, it talks about the additive inverse property. So I want you to try these two on your own. Circle all the ones that you think meet each of the criteria, then press play again to see if you are right. How did you do? Were you able to get all the same answers that I got? Hopefully for number 5, you circled the to right-hand side. Remember, when we're talking about identity, we want to be multiplying by 1. And in number 6, hopefully you got additive inverse. Remember, you want to be adding together to get 0. Now looking at examples C, it says put a box around the 2 steps that show the given property. So again, you're going to try this one on your own. So you're going to pause the video now, then press play again to see if you are right. How did you do? Did you get the same answers that I did? Hopefully you did. Remember that when you're doing these type of problems, you're trying to figure out 2 different steps. So you have to figure out what happened between one step and the next step to see if you have the correct answer. So in number 7, I had 16 times 1 over 6. Okay, so that's setting me up to do the property. And then that cancels out to give me 1. So I know that was the inverse property because it went from multiplying 16 times its inverse to 1. In number 8, again, I have 0 plus 20, so that's one step. It doesn't actually complete the property. But then when it equals 20, then I know the property's been performed. So remember, you're looking for one step to set you up for the property and the second step to complete the property. That brings us to the end of this video, so if you like this video, go ahead and throw us a thumbs up. If you love this video, go ahead and throw us a sub, and we will catch you in the next one.